What if the person who held your future in their hands was the very one making your life a living hell? What if the person who had the power to crush your dreams was also the one who looked right past your worth? For DeShawn Harris, these weren't just abstract questions. They were the harsh realities he confronted every day. And everything came to a breaking point one fateful morning when his patience finally wore thin, and everything changed. DeShawn Harris, 29, sat quietly at his desk in the HR department of Creston Enterprises, a corporate giant known for its sleek buildings and polished image. But beneath the facade of corporate perfection, DeShawn knew the truth. The company was rotten with systemic discrimination. And at the center of it all was Stephen Blake, the senior HR manager, a man in his 40s, white, rich, and powerful. DeShawn had learned early that working in a company like Creston Enterprises came with a cost, being overlooked, underpaid, and most of all, being subjected to the subtle, insidious racism that pervaded the office. DeShawn, the only black man in his department, had spent years enduring Blake's belittling comments, passive-aggressive remarks, and discriminatory decisions. He knew Blake saw him as just another employee, someone he could dismiss, disregard, and oppress without consequence. But DeShawn wasn't just any employee. He was sharp, resilient, and most importantly, aware. He had spent years observing the way Blake treated others, especially those of color, and he knew how to play the long game. He kept detailed notes on everything: Blake's favoritism, his subtle racist remarks, and the way he manipulated the hiring process to benefit his chosen few. DeShawn's resolve was strong, but it was not without limits. He had tried to ignore the daily slights, to keep his head down and do his job. But one day, after years of quiet suffering, something broke inside him. DeShawn's relationship with Stephen Blake was one built on a foundation of resentment and subtle animosity. Blake viewed DeShawn as a tool to meet corporate quotas, a black man who would serve as an example of diversity without actually being treated as an equal. DeShawn, in turn, loathed Blake's arrogance and dismissive attitude. He hated the way Blake would assign him menial tasks while promoting less qualified, less capable individuals simply because they were better suited for the company's culture, a culture that was undeniably white, elitist, and discriminatory. For years, DeShawn kept his mouth shut. He tolerated the subtle microaggressions, the backhanded compliments, and the discriminatory behavior. He knew better than to make waves in a company where someone like Blake held all the power. But over time, the feeling of being invisible, of being reduced to nothing more than a checkbox on a diversity form, became unbearable. The breaking point came one cold Tuesday morning. DeShawn had spent days perfecting a critical report for an upcoming meeting with upper management. This presentation was important, perhaps the most important task he'd ever worked on. He poured hours into researching the data, ensuring every number was accurate, every detail meticulously checked. This was his moment to shine. It wasn't just about the report. It was about proving to Blake and everyone else in the company that he was more than just another black man doing the grunt work. He was capable. He was intelligent. He was worth more than they gave him credit for. But when he entered Blake's office to present the report, the reaction was everything he feared. Blake barely looked at DeShawn as he handed over the presentation. Blake took one glance at the screen, let out a disdainful sigh, and threw the report aside with a swift flick of his wrist. His eyes flicked up to meet DeShawn's, but there was no recognition in his gaze, only contempt. "What is this?" Blake sneered, a sarcastic tone coloring his voice. You really think this is good enough for the meeting? Pathetic. DeShawn's heart dropped into his stomach. He had worked tirelessly on this report, yet Blake's face remained impassive. DeShawn tried to remain calm, his voice steady, but there was a tremor beneath it. I put a lot of effort into this, Mr. Blake. Blake interrupted him with a cold laugh, cutting him off. Effort doesn't mean anything if it's not up to par. I'll have someone else handle this. Maybe Sarah or John. At least they know what they're doing. The words hit DeShawn like a slap to the face. Blake wasn't just dismissing his work, he was dismissing him. The constant undermining, the subtle racism, the way Blake treated him like he was invisible. It was all too much. Blake's words hung in the air, and DeShawn's frustration began to build. He had put up with this treatment for years, but now it felt like something had snapped inside him. For once, he wasn't going to take it anymore. Blake had crossed the line. You always do this. DeShawn's voice was a little sharper than he intended, but the words came out before he could stop them. You never even give me a chance. Blake's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot for speaking to me like that. DeShawn stood there, trembling with anger. The humiliation was overwhelming, but he could feel the anger turning into something else, something more powerful. He knew this wasn't just about the report. This was about everything Blake had done to him and others like him. This was about the systemic discrimination that had been allowed to flourish under Blake's watch. DeShawn left the office, his mind racing. He could feel it deep in his gut. It was time to expose the truth. He wasn't going to let Blake get away with this anymore. But he also knew that going after someone like Blake wasn't easy. Blake was entrenched in the system, untouchable in the eyes of the company. It would take more than words to take him down. DeShawn had to be strategic. DeShawn spent the next few hours gathering his thoughts, trying to calm his mind. He knew what he had to do. He had been collecting evidence for years, the emails, the offhand comments, the whispered conversations. He had it all. Blake's discriminatory actions were not only unethical, but they were also illegal. DeShawn had the power to bring it all down. He pulled out his laptop and began to compile everything. The documented instances of favoritism, the inappropriate comments about diversity, and the video footage from a company meeting where Blake mocked the idea of hiring more minorities. DeShawn knew that if he sent this information to the right person, Blake's reign of terror would be over. But there was a risk. DeShawn had heard rumors that Margaret Collins, the CEO, might be the only one in the company who wasn't complicit in Blake's actions. She had always been vocal about creating a more inclusive workplace. If anyone could stop Blake, it was Margaret. But would she believe him? Would she take action? The decision weighed heavily on DeShawn, but he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. With a deep breath, he drafted an email to Margaret, attaching all the evidence he had carefully gathered. The subject line was simple but powerful. Exposing Stephen Blake's discriminatory practices at Creston Enterprises. He hit send, and then he waited. The next few hours felt like an eternity. DeShawn couldn't focus on anything. His mind raced, replaying every interaction with Blake, every snide remark, every moment of being made to feel less than he was. He waited for the reply, his pulse quickening with every passing minute. Finally, the email came through. DeShawn, I need you in my office. Now. His heart skipped a beat. He stood up, his legs shaking, as he walked to Margaret Collins' office. This was it. He had done everything he could. Now, all he could do was hope that Margaret would see the truth. When he entered her office, Margaret was already seated, a stern look on her face. She motioned for him to sit, her eyes scanning him for any sign of nervousness. "I've seen the evidence, DeShawn," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've reviewed everything you sent me, and I agree. Blake is gone, effective immediately." DeShawn's breath caught in his throat. Blake, the man who had made his life miserable for so long, was finally going to be held accountable. DeShawn's heart swelled with relief. But it wasn't just about Blake losing his job. It was about the truth finally being exposed. Margaret continued, "We're going public with this. The company has failed in its responsibility to foster an inclusive environment, and we need to make that right." DeShawn sat there, stunned. As Margaret went over the details of the next steps, Blake would be fired, and a company-wide review of policies and procedures would begin immediately. DeShawn was promoted to senior HR manager and tasked with overseeing the overhaul of the company's diversity initiatives. As for Blake, he was gone, his career in ruins. DeShawn watched him pack up his things, a look of disbelief on his face. For the first time, Blake was the one who had been dismissed, the one who had been made to feel small. DeShawn left Margaret's office that day with a quiet sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about winning against one person. It was about winning against a system that had kept him and others like him in the shadows for so long. Justice had been served. The lesson in DeShawn's story is clear. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. Sometimes, the biggest change starts with one individual standing up, saying enough, and taking action. One person can bring down even the most powerful of oppressors, especially when they have the courage to fight for what's right. DeShawn's fight for justice wasn't just about his own dignity. It was about exposing the ugly truth of corporate discrimination. It's about showing that no one is above accountability. When you stand up for what's right, the tables can and will turn. DeShawn walked out of Margaret Collins' office with a quiet sense of triumph. But his victory was bigger than just one person. It was about a system that had failed him, and countless others, for far too long. He had stood up, exposed the truth, and brought down the powerful. Blake, once untouchable, had been held accountable, and the company was forced to confront the very biases it had been sweeping under the rug. DeShawn had learned something valuable that day. The truth always rises, no matter how deeply it's buried, and sometimes it only takes one person, one voice, to challenge the system and turn the tide in their favor. What would you do if you were in DeShawn's shoes? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have risked everything to expose the truth? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story. Stay tuned for tomorrow's story, because justice is often served in the most unexpected ways, and you'll want to hear it first.